Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be showing you how to set up your force feedback on Forza Motorsport 7 to try and get the most realistic possible sort of feel out of the game. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm just going to mention a couple of the shortfalls of not necessarily the force feedback, but something that does have an effect on what you feel through the wheel, and that is the input latency. Now unfortunately Forza does have unusually high input latency. Whether this is a limitation of the UWP software, I don't know, but at the moment there's very limited things we can do to try and reduce it. So if you have a look at running 120 frames on VSync, you can see that there is quite a significant delay between my inputs and what's seen on screen. Compared to lift for speed at 120 frames with VSync, it's almost direct. It's very hard to notice. Now what this means is that the force feedback is being delivered to the wheel a lot quicker, so it feels a lot smoother and a lot more direct. So in Forza, unfortunately this causes a little bit of a disconnect and a little bit of delay in the force feedback. So what can we do to reduce it? Well, if you run without VSync, you can reduce the input latency a little bit, but it still is quite a bit higher than what you'd see in other simulators. But the other thing we can do is using the settings to the fullest potential without exceeding them and causing some wild oscillations, because what will happen is as the force feedback ramps up, so if we just sit the car still, just pretend I'm the force feedback at the moment, as the force feedback ramps up and then disappears, the wheel is going to continue to free spin a little while after that force has disappeared, which means during that slight delay period where the force feedback has to build up in the opposite direction in order to stop it, it allows the wheel to rotate slightly too far, and then as the force ramps up it will push it further back the other way, and that's where you get these sort of oscillating effects. So what we can do to reduce it is starting off with some basic settings. With the force feedback, we're going to start by setting the damper level. Now if you're just setting the force feedback up from scratch, I'd recommend starting from these settings. So your vibration scale on 0, everything else on the default value of 100. Your road feel scale off, because we can adjust that later because it's more of an after effect. Load sensitivity also on 100, and spring and damper on 0. Now what we're going to do is use a little bit of the damper to help decelerate the wheel, which will help reduce the oscillations. So all you want to do is just slowly start applying the damper value. Now if you're on PC, you'll need to make sure the damper is enabled in the force feedback or the wheel driver. If it's disabled in the driver, it means the damper will be ignored by the wheel. The damper signal from the game will be ignored by the wheel completely. So make sure you have that on, and if you are on PC as well, make sure when you make these adjustments you click save, because if you just click back it's not going to save the changes. So now while we're sitting completely still, so I've only just put 10 damper, and I do have a damper gain adjustment on my wheel which is at its lowest current setting. So even at 10% damper, you can see the wheel has quite a bit of weight to it, and it is now not, once my force feedback from my hands stops, the movement of the wheel pretty much stops almost the same. So what I'm going to do is lower it down a little bit because it does feel a little bit too heavy. So we'll go to 5%. Now this is going to be different for every wheel, so make sure you test this on your individual wheel. So put that to 5 and save. And then try it again. So there we go. It's a little bit lighter there now, but it's just preventing the wheel from rotating too far. So now that we've got that set, we can try starting to drive and getting the force feedback levels set. Now I am using a stock 370Z, so the way you adjust the settings should be the same, but make sure you use a car that you frequently drive or is similar to something you frequently drive, because the main thing is with the new physics-based force feedback system that Turn 10 is using, is that cars with higher mechanical grip do have potential to generate higher force feedback. So whenever you're making force feedback adjustments, always check your force feedback telemetry to make sure you're not clipping, and it's a good way to set the force feedback so you know if you're maximizing the force feedback range. Running out of breath a bit there. So as we start to drive, you can see we're not really utilising much of the force feedback range at all, and the wheel does feel a little bit disconnected from the car, which is going to make it hard to feel what the car is doing. So straight away, all I'm going to do is just go back into our force feedback options. And what we're going to do, we're not going to turn up the force feedback scale, and I'll tell you why. The force feedback scale actually scales all of the settings beneath it. So if you've set center spring or wheel damper scale, like we've set our wheel damper scale, adjusting the force feedback scale is going to scale that setting as well. So if we turn this up to 200%, we're effectively going to double the wheel damper scale. So to adjust the torque through the steering wheel, I like to use the align torque scale, because then once we've set all the other settings, it's not going to interfere with those ones that we've set. So set that to 200 and click save. We're getting a little bit more force. So we're using probably about 70% of the force feedback range now. So the wheel does feel a lot more connected with the car, and basically the more use of the force feedback range you can get, the more connected and more direct the wheel is going to feel with what the car's doing. So as you can see, as we turn the wheel and begin to understeer, the force feedback drops off. So we can feel that understeer by the wheel lightening up as we turn it too far. So it gives a nice feel, but we're still not quite maximising the force feedback range. So our next step, because we've maxed out the align torque scale, go back into our force feedback settings. Now I always tend to just try and leave the force feedback scale as is. So what we can do now is adjusting the mechanical and the pneumatic trail scales. Now if they're set at the same value, it means the force feedback drop off is going to be what Turn 10 has calculated as the realistic drop off in steering torque for each car, because each car does use the suspension geometry to calculate the mechanical trail. So if we boost these up equally and keep them at the same values, it means that that force feedback drop off is going to be realistic for each car that you get into. And the tuning of the car will affect the mechanical trail scale, as the caster trail has a direct effect on how much steering torque is generated from the caster trail. And if you think of it as like a spanner, basically if you put a spanner on a nut and you apply pressure to it, the more pressure you apply, the more torque is being applied to that nut. And basically the caster trail is just the length of the arm. So as you lengthen the arm and apply the same pressure, it's going to increase the torque. So higher caster will have higher mechanical torque, lower caster will have less mechanical torque. So we'll save that and go back to the track again and just check where we're at on the force feedback scale. So you can see we're almost maximizing the force feedback scale now. So I'm getting quite high peaks, but we're not clipping the force feedback, which is good, which is what we want. So now I've got a pretty good feel through the wheel without clipping, but there is a little bit of clipping there. But little bits like that aren't too bad, because you can still feel the force feedback drop off. And because the force feedback is dropping off, it's causing it to the wheel to rotate not quite as fast as I would like for drifting. You can see the line is sort of just underneath the 50% force range. So this is where tuning the balance of mechanical and pneumatic torque comes into play. So because I'm a drifter, I like sliding the cars quite a lot. I prefer to have a higher mechanical trail torque. So what we're going to do is, I'm pretty happy with the level, so what we're going to do is just reduce the pneumatic and then increase the mechanical to compensate for that that loss of pneumatic torque. Now these aren't exactly one-to-one, so you can use a one-to-one adjustment, so they are minus 25 off the pneumatic and then added 25 to the mechanical. But typically I think the pneumatic trail torque is actually slightly higher than the mechanical torque, so we'll go a little bit higher on the mechanical torque just to try and compensate. You can use the one-to-one adjustment, but you'll probably find depending which way you're adjusting it, you'll need to adjust one slightly more than the other. So you can see we're still not clipping the force feedback, but our drop-off is starting to reduce. So now we're just above 50% in the force feedback, which means when I let the wheel rotate on its own, it's going to rotate a little bit faster. It's still not quite fast enough for my liking. So we'll go back in there and go to our advanced, and we'll just drop this down a little bit more. We'll go down to 60, and we'll put this up to, so we'll just drop it 30, so we'll go up to 200. But like I said, as long as you're checking the force feedback telemetry each time you make changes to the scales, then you'll be able to see if you're clipping or not. So you can see we're not clipping, and our force feedback drop off now is getting quite a lot less, which means we should be able to drift with reasonable speed of the force feedback. Now, our wheel isn't quite rotating as fast as I would like it to, and that's mainly because the damper will hinder some of the effectiveness of the force feedback. It will help reduce the oscillations. So what we can do there is make use of the dynamic damper setting that Turn 10 has implemented. So if we head down here to so our wheel damper scale is still at 5% because that suits my wheel perfectly. Now if we turn the dynamic damper all the way on, basically what this is going to do is, as the car starts to slip, it's going to reduce the damper level to preserve the force feedback, to keep it at a higher fidelity. So now if I do it again, just do a couple of spins, you can see the damper's gone down to 0, and our wheel's a bit more responsive now when it's trying to rotate to catch the car. We're still rotating a little bit slow for my liking, so what I can do is, I'm not maximizing the force feedback on my wheel. I can bump that up a notch, so then I'm still going to have a little bit of feel for the understeer as the force feedback has that slight drop off, but the wheel is going to rotate a little bit faster again because I've pushed up the force feedback coming out of the wheel. So now I'm feeling a lot more confident now the wheel is catching the car the way I like it to. I can rely on the force feedback. And I can feel what the car's doing quite nicely. So that I'm quite happy with the balance of the torques at the moment. I can just feel the understeer when the force feedback drops. Ooh. So now that I'm happy with the base, the core of the force feedback that we've got it set now we can start playing with the other settings and adding a little bit more flavour to the force feedback. So we go back into our settings again. So the ones that add a bit of flavour are obviously your vibration. Now, because I'm a drifter, I don't like using the vibration that Turn 10 was implemented, simply because it doesn't matter what wheels slip on the car, whether it's lateral slip or like brake lock-up or handbrake slip. As soon as any tyre on the car slips, the wheel will start to vibrate quite violently. So if I turn this up to maximum, just to demonstrate. So as I was saying, as soon as any of the wheels start to break traction in any direction, the wheel will just start vibrating. And there's also vibrations, you can't really see it on the graph there, but you can, I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the video, the wheel is actually shaking already, and that's purely just from the engine in the car. Basically it's trying to simulate the vibration through the car of the engine, and it just adds a lot of unnecessary noise to the force feedback, in my opinion. I'm not a big fan of it. So if I pull the handbrake, even just going in a straight line, you can see that there's quite a lot of vibration, which doesn't feel realistic to me, which is why I prefer not to use it. It would feel okay, in my opinion, if you could remove the vibrations from the rear tyre slip and just have it based on the front tyre slip, since it's only really the front wheels that are connected to the steering wheel. But for that reason alone, I choose not to use the in-game vibration. So I always run that at 0. Now if you're a circuit racer, you can use this to your advantage, as it will tell you, give you more information on when your tyres are starting to break traction, which would be very useful. So we'll go down to our next setting, which is the road feel scale, and this basically just adds some noise to the force feedback to simulate the surface texture of the road. So if we turn this up to 100 and save, so you can see we're getting a bit of noise there through the force feedback, and just basically just trying to simulate the texture of the road. So we're at quite a smooth surface here at the moment, so the force feedback is quite smooth. If we go to a slightly rougher area, I don't know if there is one on this open airfield, but basically the rougher the surface, the more texture is going to sort of be added to the force feedback. So as you can see here, this is quite a rough surface, so there's a lot of noise and texture going on there, whereas if I quickly turn that road feel scale off, so where were we? Road feel scale, so if I turn that back to 0, it's going to smoothen out that force feedback again. So it really depends on how much texture you want coming through the wheels. So it is a rougher surface, so there is already some force feedback texture that comes through just based on because it is a suspension based or physics based force feedback system, so all that sort of movement through the suspension and the tyres is going to sort of come through the force feedback anyway. So you see there's still quite a bit of texture there, but you can add that extra layer of texture using the road feel scale. Now you might be wondering what that big giant shudder in the force feedback was. For whatever reason, Turn 10 has added an automatic vibration into the force feedback when the tyres are near basically peak combined slip. So that's the lateral and longitudinal grip of the tyre. So if I load the force feedback up a little bit and start applying the brake, as it sort of reaches the grip limit of the tyre in combined slip, it'll start to vibrate. So as we apply the brake, you can see that vibration there, and that's basically just to indicate that the tyre is being pushed at its limit. And it kind of works okay, but it can be a little bit distracting when you accidentally, or even just like if you're in a drift and you're transitioning and you touch the brake, or if you're trying to left foot brake in a tandem, it can add quite a bit of instability to the force feedback, which I'm not a big fan of. It would be nice if they had that as an option to remove it, but unfortunately they don't at the moment. So as you can see there, now what also causes that is there is a glitch in the physics of the game, where at low speeds, like really low speeds, the slip angle of the tyre is actually exaggerated in the first few like 90 degrees of input. So you can see there the tyre friction is going from like 20 to 30% back down to its normal. So you can see we shouldn't be hitting those sort of values of slip at low speeds, but then when you get to the low speed threshold, it will suddenly jump up, and you'll see the yellow line in the center of the tyre will start to extend past where it should be. And it's also the point where basically the force feedback doesn't work, so there's no force at these low speed settings, but when you're sort of decelerating, sometimes that jump in force can sort of come through the wheel, where you'll get those odd, like really sharp spikes in the force feedback. It's just a little bit of a glitch in the low speed physics. Normally, I mean, you're not going to spend much time driving around there, but if you do, it's just something to be aware of. It's not, your wheel's not braking, it's just a bit of a glitch in the low speed physics of the game. So we'll move on to our next setting, into our controller. Okay, so we're going down the list. So we've talked about the dynamic damper behavior, so you can use this to minimize the effect of the damper scale when the wheel, basically when you push past the slip angle of the front or rear tires, it will preserve the force feedback fidelity by removing the damper, and this basically just works as a percentage. So if you put it at 50, when the car starts to break away, it's going to reduce the damper by 50%. Is basically all that setting does. So if you're drifting and you want to minimize the force feedback oscillations, you put a little bit of damper, and then you can basically make it remove the damper when you're sideways, to help sort of the wheel to rotate and just keep that force feedback at as much fidelity as possible. So our next setting is load sensitivity. Now this one is a bit of an odd one. It's basically meant to scale the amount of torque that's increased or reduced from the load increase on the tires. Now I used to run this at 50%, and keep in mind that this is also scaled by the force feedback scale, which is also why I like to keep it at 100, because it keeps things nice and simple. I used to run it around 50 because I thought that gave it the smoothest possible settings, but I think there's a bit of a glitch with this system as well, simply because if we lower this down to 50, which should produce the smoothest forces possible, basically as the load increases, it's not going to increase the steering torque, which will keep the force feedback nice and smooth. If we bring up our force feedback again, as I increase the load on the tires, while the force stays relatively constant, as the load changes, you get these weird notches in the force feedback. Now I think this setting might work differently for each car as well. So it is kind of dropping the force feedback scale there a bit, but that notching in and out of the load sensitivity, just, it feels very odd. So at the moment we're kind of losing force, and then it spikes back up again. So at the moment in this car, especially for this video, I've been running at 100 because it seems to produce the smoothest force possible. You still get a slight notching, but it seems to reduce it quite a bit. So this one I'll definitely have a look at it per car, because some cars I found worked really good at around 50 or 60, but this one definitely requires at about 100. It probably depends quite a bit on the suspension of the car as well, because this one's got quite a bit more movement to it, being a totally stock car. I think 100 suits it better. So if we have a look now, you can still see that it spikes a bit, but it's minimized. Oops, and we're hitting the slip angle of the tire there. So you still get those slight notches in there, but it is minimized. And I'm not sure what that could be. It is a bit of a unusual sort of force. I don't know whether it's just a bit of a glitch, or I'm not sure. But that one is I'd say probably just leave that one at 100 and be done with it, because 100 seems to produce the most realistic force. But like I said, there is still that slight glitch in there when the load increases. Mainly, it could just be something to do with the brake pedal. Pressing the brake and increasing the combined slip of the tyre might be causing that bit of an effect. But basically at 100, as you go over bumps and the load increases on the tyre, you're going to feel that through the force feedback. So onto our next setting, which is where are we? So we've done load sensitivity, we've talked about the damper scale and the dynamic damper. So the next one is basically just the center spring. Now the center spring, since the last force feedback update, has been made a dynamic force. So it depends on certain physics parameters as to when the center spring is enabled. So we'll just turn it up to 50 and have a look, because last time I tested this it didn't work on my wheel. There was no center spring at all. So if we stop the car, you can see the center spring scale is supposed to be at 0. Actually, I'd probably have the spring turned off on here, but no, even if I turn the spring gain on my wheel all the way up to maximum, there's still no center spring force. So I don't know whether this setting just doesn't work on PC. I'd like to, if someone could test it on the console or even other PCs with different wheel setups, and see if they have center spring force being applied. But for me, there doesn't seem to be any noticeable difference in when using center spring and like at maximum or having it completely off. I thought it could. There we go. That's where the center spring works. So I do have center spring. It appears to only work in the menus for me. So you can see here I can turn it off on my wheel. Okay, that's definitely the center spring force. So I've just turned the center spring gain to 0 on my wheel. If I turn it all the way up, I now have center spring. So it seems that center spring only works in the menus to recenter the wheel. So if we go into the game, even though it says the center spring scale is applied, it's not doing anything until I pause the game, and then it centers the wheel. So it seems that the center spring might not work in game on the track, but it does definitely work in the menus. Okay, so we'll just turn that back off. So I'll leave that center spring value as is, actually, because for me it doesn't affect the driving at all. But it definitely recenters the wheel, and I have had a couple of times where I join a race and I think my wheel's centered and I forget to check, and I go to take off, and then all of a sudden I'm going in one direction because I'm turned the wheel a full rotation. So that center spring would definitely help with that issue, as when you're in the menus it's automatically going to return it to center. But that pretty much covers all the settings that we can sort of utilize for the force feedback. So it's kind of like a 3-step process. Basically, you want to set your force feedback range, make sure you're maximizing the force feedback, set your flavor or the preference in your balance. So if you're a circuit racer, you might want more force feedback drop off to help indicate when you're starting to push past the peak slip angle of the tire. But for me, being a drifter, I need the wheel to feel connected with the car at all times, and also need it to rotate quite quickly. And the force feedback scale is essentially a direct relation to how fast the wheel will spin. The more force feedback there is being output, the faster the wheel is going to rotate. So I need that minimum drop off to keep the wheel self-aligning at a high speed. And another thing I'll quickly touch on too is, once you have all this set up, if you're struggling to find when a car steps out, if you can't quite find the sweet spot of counter steering without the car snapping in the opposite direction, there is a setting that Turn 10 has implemented that you may already be using, but if not, it's just another thing to consider, is the steering assist. Now, simulation is complete one-to-one with the physics, and it basically drives the way Turn 10 intended it to. If you put it on normal steering, basically it dampens the weight transfers of the car. Now, I have an older video explaining the differences between the two, because there was a lot of confusion going around quite some time ago about people thought that simulation steering was broken, and I was always of the opinion that it worked as intended. It was just the force feedback wasn't up to the task of keeping the wheel sort of connected with the car so you can feel what's happening, and that definitely seems to ring true with all the force feedback updates, and even with the custom force feedback that I use with the EmuWheel software. But simulation does seem to work really well. Can be a little bit twitchy at times depending on the car, but by all means, if you have issues trying to catch the car when it breaks loose on simulation and you get into big tank slappers, I always recommend to use normal steering, just because some force feedback wheels like a Logitech may not be up to the task of keeping up with the physics on simulation steering. A combination of they're not a fast wheel, they're not very strong, and also in combination with that delay between the wheel and the game as well. So normal steering will most likely be the preferred steering input, just because it does make the car more stable as it dampens the physics, but it does come at the cost of the car agility. So if we have a quick look, you've seen me driving a bit on simulation steering, so I can make the car change direction quite quickly. So if I'm turning that way, I want to go back this way, or even during the slide, I want to go that way, and I've cooked it. Whereas normal steering will delay those reactions quite a bit. So if we go on normal, we'll make the car more stable at the cost of being less agile. So I want to go this way, I want to go that way. You can see how slow it is to respond. And then in the drift, I want to go that way, and it didn't want to change direction. So basically it limits the inertia of the car to make it more stable, which will make it a lot easier to drive if your wheel isn't up to the task of sort of giving you the information you need to control the car confidently. Anyway, that's going to wrap up the video. It's been quite a long one. Hope it was useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers, bye.